Hi, guys. So, as you know, we've been talking about the civil rights movement, which took place during the 1950s and 1960s. There's some terms that I want you guys to be familiar with. The first term is disenfranchisement. So during this time, African Americans experienced disenfranchisement. All that means is that they were being denied the right to do something, and in this case, they were being denied the right to vote. Okay, so white people did this in a number of different ways. Okay, especially in the South. They kept African Americans from voting by using poll taxes. When you take a poll of something, it means you are allowing them to vote. And a tax is money that you pay to the government in order to do something. So a poll tax charged African Americans money in order for them to be able to vote. And because most African Americans were poor at this time, they couldn't afford to pay the tax. So this was a way for Southern whites to keep them from being able to vote. They also put in place literacy tests. So basically, they said, okay, if you want to be able to vote, you can vote. But in order for you to be able to vote, you have to take this literacy test and pass it. Literacy means reading. So we know that since most African Americans are poor at this time, most of them can't read either. Remember, things were segregated, schools weren't equal. So African Americans, in a lot of cases, didn't receive any education, or definitely not the same educations as would receive. Okay, so requiring African Americans to take and pass these literacy tests was another way to prevent them from voting, because of course, most of them aren't going to pass. They also used something called the grandfather clause. This allowed whites to vote without taking tests because their grandfathers had voted. So it basically means that if your grandfather voted, then you don't have to take the literacy test. And what do we know? We know that most whites' grandfathers have voted before because there's no laws prohibiting them from voting. Whereas with African Americans, most of their grandfathers have not been allowed to vote. Remember, we had slavery. They didn't have any rights. They weren't even considered citizens for years. So that was a way for whites to get around having to take the literacy test. Okay. Whites also use violence. They threaten African Americans with death if they voted. Remember, we had the KKK around at this time, which stands for Ku Klux Klan. They burned crosses on African Americans' lawns to try to scare them. They threw rocks into their windows as they slept at night. They killed and lynched. Lynched means hung African Americans, all in an effort to prevent them from voting. Now, why would they do that? Why would whites be so mean? Why would they do that to African Americans? What's so important about voting? Well, we know when we vote, it gives people power. It gives them a say. It makes it possible for change to happen. So that's why it was so important that African Americans be allowed to vote. Because when you can vote people into office, that means you have a say in who's representing you and the things that you want. Okay. So if we take a look, these are some documents that you may see in DBQ questions that I want you to familiarize yourself with. So this is a poll tax receipt. Okay. So if somebody were to go and vote and pay the poll tax, this is the receipt that they would get. Okay. Here, this just shows the sign that says voters take literacy tests here. Remember that if you were white, then the grandfather clause would most likely apply and you wouldn't have to take the literacy test. This was really meant to for African Americans, because they knew African Americans most likely would not be able to pass this literacy test. So that's what this is showing. And here is another DBQ. If we look closely at this one, it shows here's whites only, and there the white man is going up on the escalator. Okay, this is meant to show that it's not going to be very hard for them to go and vote. See how it says vote here? The path for whites is very easy. They're on the escalator. They're just gliding up without a care in the world. Where here it says this voting booth this way, and here's the African American, and look at all these obstacles, all these hurdles. Like he's running a race and he has to jump over this hurdle, which is the literacy test. Okay, he's got to try to pass that. He's got to jump over this hurdle, which is the poll tax. He's got to try to, find what way to pay for the poll tax. Now he's got to jump over this hurdle, the grandfather clause. Okay, he has to go through all of these hurdles. And look, KKK members, all these people with dogs trying to chase him down. He's got to go through all these hurdles just to get here to vote. When look how easy it is for the white man to just go up on the escalator. So this is just a visual representation of what it was like for them. Okay. So these are just some of the terms that I want to make sure that you're familiarized with. Again, that's disenfranchisement. That is African Americans being denied the right to vote. You should also know literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clause.